The artificial demand for dollars around the world is largely due to the fact that 60% of central banks have the dollar sitting in reserves. If the dollar isn't there, because nobody wants to use the dollar, we're screwed. All that artificial demand for dollars disappears, and we crater.
So what does it look like when we default?
It can get very bad very quickly.
Can you paint a scenario?
If the dollar isn't the reserve currency, we're screwed. Like, we become, I don't know, Argentina. It can be very bad. So let's back up. I'll begin with our fiscal deficits, and I'll take this back to why the dollar is important.
Okay.
So right now, we spend $7 trillion. That's the latest budget proposal. And we generate in tax revenue like 4.9 trillion, right? So there's a deficit of, roughly $2 trillion a year. Now, people don't understand unless you can make it real for them. So let's take out a bunch of zeros. Let's assume you as an individual are making $49,000 a year and you're spending $70,000 a year. Well, okay, that's bad.
Mm-hmm.
That's fiscally irresponsible, but that's what we're doing as a country. If it's you as an individual in that scenario where you're like $20,000 short every year, what do? Well, you max out your credit card 1 year. Okay, that covers you the first year. The second year, you take out a loan from the bank to pay maybe your credit card or whatnot. But over time, that's not sustainable. So what happens is when we have a shortfall, the way we generate revenue in shortfalls, other than tax revenue, right? Tax revenues are 4.9 trillion. How do you get to 7? Well, we issue bonds, right? So we sell bonds around the world, and when people don't buy, for whatever reason, the Fed buys the bonds. The Fed is the buyer of last resort. So you've seen the Fed balance sheet basically go from like 4 trillion to like 8 trillion because they're the ones buying everything. Well, how are they buying it? Well, they buy it by printing money. And so the printing presses have been off the charts, certainly since COVID and throughout this administration. And that, of course, has caused inflation and a lot of other problems, which we can go into. Now, the artificial demand for dollars around the world is largely due to the fact that 60% of central banks have the dollar sitting in reserves, okay? And also because the dollar is used as the unit of trade for commodities, for foreign exchange. Like if you want to go from Colombian pesos to, Indonesian rupiah, you have to go through the dollar.
Mm-hmm.
If the dollar isn't there, because nobody wants to use the dollar, we're screwed. All that artificial demand for dollars disappears, and we crater. We're not going to forget financing the next aircraft carrier. We're not going to be able to pay Medicare. And that's when things get really, really bad. And it just takes leadership in our government, in our Congress, and in our executive branch to say, enough. We can't fund everything. And there are things that, look, we have 88 million people on Medicare, 65 million people on Medicaid, 8 million on disability, 44 million on food stamps. That's like, I don't know, I'm not good at doing math in my head, but that's like a little over 200 million people in America that depend on the government. That's not sustainable.
There's only, 350 million?
340 million, something like that, 336. So so we have to do something to really rein in our spending. And we're adding $1 trillion of debt every 100 days. And so
Who do we owe the debt to?
Mainly ourselves. We do have a bunch of foreign debt buyers. China had at some point, close to, maybe $1.5 trillion or 2 trillion, and they've been paring that down. They've been selling. Why? Because they don't want to get sanctioned. They learned from Russia. Once Russia invaded Ukraine, we basically sanctioned everything. We took all their money and we're like, okay, it's ours. So when you have a central bank that has dollars in reserves, it's not like there are bales and bales of money sitting in the Russian central bank in a dungeon. It's sitting at the Fed. And so we can like turn the money off whenever we want. And so China was like, I don't know that I like this. So I think I'm going to start selling treasuries. So it's a problem. And the debt is a problem for many reasons. We're always issuing new debt, and there's debt that gets paid back. And as we start paying back some of these shorter duration loans and bonds and government obligations, we have to borrow at a new rate. And that new rate is really high. And so, I mean, the 3-month, I think, is like 5% and change. It used to be 0. And so now we're borrowing money at higher interest rates, which means we have to pay, our government is paying more in interest on our debt, like over $1 trillion in interest alone. And we're paying 850 billion for our Defense Department. We're paying more in interest, just in interest to service the debt, than we are paying for the Defense Department. You tell me, is that sustainable? We're screwed unless somebody changes things in a very radical way. And in DC, nobody seems to care.
So the people that own the debt are
the Fed,
bonds.
The
People buy bonds.
Yes, the notes and the bonds. There's an entire marketplace. Some are owned by big financial firms. Your 401k probably has a bunch of government bonds in it. So it's owned by ourselves individually through our 401ks. It's owned by large corporations like BlackRock and Vanguard and so forth, Goldman Sachs. It's owned by the Fed. It's owned by institutional buyers, foreign buyers like the Saudis and the Japanese. It's owned by a lot of people.
And can they call and collect?
So the way a bond works is I owe you $100. I'll pay you back in 5 years with interest. I'll pay you 5% interest a year, and then in 5 years, I pay you the principal. So they do come to collect once the bond is due.
And that's what the foreign countries are doing as well.
Yeah, I mean, well,
They're buying so it's all bonds. It is all.
So you have many types of government obligations. You've got a 3-month, you've got a 6-month, you've got a 10-year, a 5-year. So there are lots of bond durations. And there's a giant marketplace for this. People are buying and selling these bonds all the time. It's not like that IOU that you just purchased from me, like I owe you $100, I'll pay back in 5 years. You can take that IOU and sell it to your sister. And your sister can sell it. And then there becomes a secondary market for these. And there's like a giant marketplace of people buying and selling bonds.
Okay. So what does it look like when we default?
I don't want to be around when that happens.
I'll
be in a Mennonite colony in Paraguay, living off the land or something. No, but joking aside, it can get very bad very quickly.
Can you paint a scenario?
Sure. A scenario where it can happen very quickly, and it can happen over a long period of time. Over a long period of time, people start losing faith in the dollar. Our obligations become less and less valuable to them. Faith and credit in the U.S. dollar becomes impaired. The dollar loses a tremendous amount of value. It depreciates significantly compared to a lot of other places. We see huge amounts of inflation. Perhaps hyperinflation, or it can happen very suddenly, where we just can't meet the obligations of the federal government. So, we have $7 trillion that we need to pay out every year in whatever, right? And maybe we have to fire people. We have to fire the 24 million government workers. By the way, there are twice the number of government employees than there are manufacturing employees.
Man, that's
12 million versus 24 million.
So when you told me that last night, that blew my mind.
Maybe we have to fire people. Maybe people have to take a haircut on what they think that they're due. Maybe we can't afford a lot of the social programs, some of which are very important to people in poor communities. And these people in poor communities are saying, well, that was my lifeblood. Like, now I can't buy food. And people get really pissed off.
No matter where you're watching Shawn Ryan Show from, if you get anything out of this, please like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, share this everywhere you possibly can. And if you're feeling extra generous, please leave us a review on Apple and Spotify podcasts.